Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, November the 18th, on another rainy Vancouver morning, as we're probably becoming used to, and will be used to, because I think it's going to rain for at least another week or so. Let's see who's here. Who is here? So Sal is here. Good morning to you. And Gabrielle is here. Hello, Gabrielle. Good morning. Daniel's here. Hey, Daniel. Mike is here. Good morning, Mike. John is here. Good morning. John is here. Good morning to you, John. Vicky's here. Hello, Vicky. And George is here. Good morning, George. And Sam is here as well. Good morning to you, Sam. So what will we do today? I've got some talking to do about, we'll review what we talked about the day before yesterday and yesterday with our article. We'll talk a little bit about white supremacy. I've got a little thing for you to read on white supremacy. And depending on where we get to, I may have a short video for you tomorrow, or I may not. I just have to figure out where it is. I won't explain it. We may have a video tomorrow. I just have to figure that out. The other thing I will do for you today is I'll give you the assignment for the final paper, although I know I haven't returned your micropaper 2 to you, but I'll assign this so you can start thinking about it, and then I'll get those grades and comments to you absolutely as soon as I can. I'm going to try and get a bunch of them done later today, and so, but I think you should just be able to get started anyway. The due date for, I'll just say very quickly, the due date for it is going to be Sunday, December the 6th. I was going to try for the Friday, but I was honest with myself and said I don't think I'm going to mark them on the weekend, so you may as well have the weekend to work on them rather than I make them due on Friday and then I don't look at them until Monday anyway. You may as well have that weekend to work on them. So it'll be end of day Sunday, December the 6th. I'll ask you, for the final paper, I'll ask you to do about 1,500 words, so about double the size of the normal the normal micropaper. But again, I'll be looking for a lot of the same things, and I'll be looking for you to sort of build the paper in the same way. It'll just be a little larger, right? And so, and I'll also be looking for you to show me that you've been in this class and show me that you get it, right? So that's kind of one of the things I'll be looking for. So I'll be looking for you to, find good sources and to build an argument and make your case and explain things. But I'll also be looking for evidence of, does this person understand what we've been talking about? Can they use the terminology that we've talked about? Can they talk about things in the way that we've been talking about them? The short version is, do you get it? Right? And so I'll be kind of looking for that as well, but we can talk about that a little bit later, okay? Yesterday, or maybe the day before yesterday, we finished watching that Eighth Fire documentary, and we said that Indigenous people have to grapple or battle with a number of stereotypes or prejudicial ideas against them, right? And we heard in the video that there are these kind of negative stereotypes circulating around society. And again, these stereotypes are interesting because a lot of them have to do with historical precedent. A lot of them have to do with the effects of the sort of awful treatment of Indigenous people in Canada. Some of them have to do with ideologies of meritocracy. Some of them have to do with religious ideas about, hard work and what's good and what's bad. Some of them have to do with economic issues and the perception of, is everyone paying their way? Is everyone paying their share, right? And so, I'll contrast this to, this idea that First Nations people get free money from the government, which they kind of don't. Actually, they get less government support than the average Canadian citizen. But yet many people are okay with the idea of someone like Donald Trump paying $750 of tax, over 10 years, even though he's worth billions and billions of dollars. And so, some people seem to be not okay with even the idea that First Nations people would get slightly more support than the average Canadian, which they don't. They get less. However, we have situations where someone who can be worth apparently billions and billions of dollars can pay effectively no tax. So, I don't know, maybe that's just me saying that. Maybe I'll just move on before I get myself in trouble. But again, the video, I've already gotten myself in trouble. But the video, I think, did show us that we have here in Canada a living, breathing, functioning First Nations cultures, right? And again, they're trying to recover from their history in Canada. They're trying to reclaim their culture. And we see people doing that in lots of different ways, right? Through art, through education, through community programs and supports, through kind of personal processes of kind of rediscovering who they are and what it means to be an Indigenous person here, now, in Canada today. And I think that a lot of what we saw is encouraging, right? That's nice to see. But I also reported that I feel like non-Indigenous Canada is not really paying attention to what's going on right now. Our media environment has been kind of soaked up by Trump and his presidency and the election and COVID and China and all of these kind of really big, issues or big news stories that are being reported. And I think we've kind of lost track of some of the things that are happening in our country and things that we kind of need to be focused on inside, right? So there's a lot to look at outside, right? There's lots of oohing and awing going on south of the border, right? There's lots of things that China is doing that people are paying attention to. There's a pandemic, apparently. There is a pandemic. And yeah, we kind of lose track sometimes of the issues within our own country. But this is one that needs to be paid attention to, and I think we've kind of stumbled and forgotten about it at the moment, and we need to refocus. But again, there's still some very negative things that are occurring as well, right? So we said we had two pretty significant reports from commissions. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we talked about, the TRC, and this more recent national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, lots of the recommendations that came out of both of those reports, nothing has really happened, right? So again, disappointing. We made a step forward in investigating these situations, and then these committees said, okay, here's what we need to do to fix the situation, and very little has occurred as a result. And so again, that's kind of disappointing and frustrating, and it's one thing to sort of study the problem. That's good. You should, if you have a problem, you should figure out what's going on. But then when you are provided with some fixes, you should actually try to move forward and do some of those things, right? And Canada isn't really doing that. The Indian Act is still in force. It is still a legal. It is still a law that is in force and continues to structure the lives of Indigenous people in Canada. And again, there are a lot of different opinions about whether the Indian Act should be rewritten, or should it be thrown out, or should there be something else. It's a controversial piece of legislation, and so it's not nearly as racist or kind of targeted at assimilation as it used to be, but it's still contentious, right? It still has that smell on it, if you will, right? So again, there's controversy about that. There's still negative prejudices and stereotypes circulating through society about Indigenous people that they have to kind of battle with. And again, the statistics show us that there is systemic racism that Indigenous people experience and deal with in Canadian society. That's a thing, right? And so that's something we need to pay attention to and rectify, right? And it's something that we are not rectifying, right? And in fact, when we see the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, I think most Canadians are looking down there and are very supportive of what Black Americans are standing up for and fighting for, but we also have to remember that, you know, there's things in our own backyard that we need to rectify as well, right? So, you know, it's nice to support Black Lives Matter, and we certainly should. And of course, there are Black Canadians who have similar experiences in Canada as Black Americans do in the States, and we need to pay attention to that as well. But there's also Indigenous people, and again, this is something that needs to be dealt with, and we very frequently forget about it, unfortunately. Yeah, so yesterday we were talking a little bit, we switched gears just slightly. We reviewed kind of oppression and power and what oppression is, and we reviewed quickly what internalized dominance and internalized oppression were, because we read an academic article, right? And that academic article was Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom, the Experiences of Women Faculty of Color with White Male Students. And so Shavella Pittman's article kind of explained the results of her research into the question, actually, what are the experiences of women faculty of color in universities? She says there's been lots of research into how race and gender occur in the classroom for students, right? So how does sexism and racism affect students' learning opportunities and how they feel in their classroom? But not a lot of research has been done in terms of how teachers feel and how those things affect how they affect the experience of teachers. And so Shavella Pittman looked into that, and she made an argument. And so I think we pretty quickly identified her argument, which was nice to see. That was exciting. It was nice that, you know, we had an article that I think everybody grasped fairly well, and we were able to figure out the argument. And yeah, I was kind of really happy with how that went. And it was a real life, honest to God academic article. It's a very readable one for sure. It's written very clearly and plainly. Not all of them are like that, unfortunately, although they should be. But yeah, we figured out the argument quite quickly, right? And so part of that process was not only figuring out the argument, but kind of learning a little bit about how academic articles work. Because again, for the most part, they are all built the same. It doesn't matter if it's a sociology or a psychology or a geology or a engineering or physics or whatever the discipline is. Many of these papers are built the same way. They're built with the same pieces. And so if you know that, it makes them a lot easier to read your way through, particularly if you're an undergrad student and you're short of time because you've got 4 other classes to deal with, and you've got a job and you've got some sort of a social life that you're trying to maintain. You got to prioritize, right? And so I suggested that, you know, in an academic article like this, in most cases, you could probably skip a few of these items, right? You could probably read the abstract to just quickly figure out what the paper is about, and then really jump to the data or the results, and then to the analysis or the discussion, right? So, because that's the point of the paper, right? What question is being asked, and what's the answer to it, right? And also, why should we care about the answer? That's usually what the discussion and conclusion is about. Why is this important, right? Why should we be paying attention to the results of this paper? And so, yeah, you can kind of jump ahead and sort of just read these things in pieces and not worry too much about all of the detail, because most profs won't want you to pay attention to every little bit. They'll want you to figure out what the paper is arguing and why it's important. And I think we were able to do that pretty clearly, right? So I think that's what we came up with yesterday, right? So we said that women of color who teach in higher learning experience gendered racism in the classroom, and usually that those interactions come from white male students. And again, it's important to point out here that I think Shavella Pittman didn't ask specifically about white male students, right? Because that would kind of bias her results. She just said, what are your experiences in the classroom as a woman of color, as a professor who is a woman and who is a person of color? And this is kind of the results that came out, right? This is the pattern that Shavella Pittman started to see, is that white male students frequently challenge the authority or the scholarly expertise or the teaching competency of their female professors of color. And sometimes that even goes so far as to threaten them or to intimidate them, right? And so we saw male students were less likely to use female professors' official title as Dr. Dr. So-and-so. I probably should be saying Dr. Pittman here instead of Shavella Pittman, but I actually don't know if she's a doctor or not. I assume she is. I should be saying Dr. Pittman, but then again, I often call people by their first names, like Jordan Peterson. I was calling him Jordan and Jordy. So, but still, Dr. Pittman. Yeah, so sometimes there are challenges to authority, to their teaching competency, their expertise in their field, or even challenging the legitimacy of their field in general, right? And so seeing certain types of scholarship, certain types of scientific disciplines as more legitimate, and then the sort of areas that these women are experts in as kind of, softer science or kind of foofy or just not real knowledge, right? The real knowledge is over here. What these women are doing is kind of, kind of floofy, right? Kind of soft. And again, that's not true, but that's how these students sometimes respond. And again, we saw that they sometimes were threatening or intimidating to these professors as well, right? So sometimes it had to do with body language. Sometimes it had to do with throwing papers on desks, which is incredibly rude and that you should never do, especially if you want a professor to reconsider a grade that they have given you. Throwing the paper in their face is not the ticket to that. Being respectful and asking nicely is a good start. But again, these students feel that they are that they're able to behave this way, right? There was one thing I wanted to say about this, and I've lost it now. Hang on, give me 1 second. No, it's gone. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it'll come back. So I was kind of suggesting here that there was some internalized dominance and internalized oppression going on, right? So these kind of little kind of microaggressions or sort of direct challenges may have something to do with white male students' feelings of dominance, right? So they're in the dominant group, and they're in two dominant groups in society. They're men and they're white, right? And so we mentioned that, of course, social messaging kind of confirms the worldview of white men, right? It makes it seem as if the way that they see the world, the things that they think are important, the way that they think things work, social messaging says that that's correct. That's actually the way it is. And so sometimes people in dominant groups have a difficult time accommodating other viewpoints because everything in their socialization tells them that they're right. And so I have a question for you, though. Do you think, now I know you have no way of knowing this, but this is a little bit of speculation. Do you think that these white males who were kind of challenging these female professors of color or acting in this way, do you think they were aware of the fact that they were doing this, that they were perhaps treating these professors differently than they would a white male professor? Do you think they were aware? Sorry?
One of them was doing it, like when he said like you're just only 10 or 30% of
right.
American and I'm privileged because I'm white. He said that.
Right. So definitely that guy probably was, right? So there was the one guy in class who very clearly said that, black people are 10% of the US population, and if you want something, you have to fight for it, but we'll squash you anyway. That's a pretty clearly racist, prejudicial statement, right? And so I think he was aware of that. But what about some of these other challenges?
Like the guy who sent the email, like she refers to the professor as a person. Maybe he doesn't aware of that. Because you, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think influenced? Let's say, okay, so this is the example of the guy who sent the email to the female professor, and he said, oh hi Kate, Dr. So and so said I should talk to you, right? So in the same email, he's referring to this male professor as Dr. whoever, and then she's getting referred to as Kate. Why would someone do that? I suspect he probably wasn't aware of
Yeah, like
that distinction.
he was socialized that like women are not professors.
Yeah, that's true, right? And so, again, this kind of idea of social lenses come in, right? And so we've talked about it with, or filters, right? We talked about it with the applications, right, that were sent out from the University of Chicago. We talked about that. I had an example about a kindergarten teacher. Do you remember my kindergarten teacher example? Where if we were going to hire a kindergarten teacher, most of the time we envision kindergarten teachers to be women, right? And so when we're flipping through the applications, yeah, okay, woman, young woman, young woman, young woman, oh, man, right? And he stands out. He doesn't fit our idea of what a kindergarten teacher should be, and all of a sudden we start asking questions about this guy. Who is he? Why does he want to teach young kids? Can he do it? Is he gay? Who knows, right? And so all of a sudden these kind of filters come down as we start to try to judge this guy based on our stereotype of who we think the kindergarten teacher should be. And often when we think of a professor, we often think of an older white man, or at least here in the West we do. And we often think of them as a little bit weird, right? A little bit quirky, right? Which again, some professors definitely are. You don't spend most of your life locked in a room reading about one particular thing and not get a little weird, I think. Lots of professors are a little bit odd. But how does that affect the situation when we expect a professor to be an older white male who's a little quirky, and then in walks this young woman of color, right? How does that affect how students perceive her and how they interact with her, right? And this might be one of the ways, right? Maybe there's this kind of conception that, oh, well, she's not as knowledgeable or not as legitimate as the professor because I know what a professor looks like, right? And again, this is all happening subconsciously for people. I know what a professor looks like. It looks like that old white kind of weird guy who always wears vests. And this woman is not that, right? She's younger, she's a woman of color, she's different, right? And so people have a hard time seeing one thing as the other, right? We have a hard time seeing the kindergarten teacher as a man sometimes, and here we have a hard time seeing the professor as this woman of color. And again, I'm not saying any of this is right. I'm just saying this is what can happen, and it happens subconsciously. It happens without people being aware, right? Let me just see so what some of these women reported in the paper was this, right? She said some of them felt that they felt disrespected, or in some cases they felt frustrated or fearful, right? And again, some of the behavior we heard about was intimidating, right? Particularly in a classroom, right? There's no physical intimidation or threatening behavior is welcome in a classroom setting, none at all, right? And so some of these students are really behaving badly, and these women, I think rightly feel threatened. Let me ask you this, do you feel that a woman in power has to act differently than a man in power? Do you feel that there are different considerations for, let's say, a female professor rather than a male professor? Do female professors, or any female in authority, do they have to do anything differently? Do they have different expectations than a man? Avera's making a microscopic nod. What are you thinking of?
Yeah, no. I don't think so.
Right.
Show a side of yourself, prove to everyone that guys don't have to prove that you are capable and confident while still maintaining your image to show that you're feminine and not absolutely crazy.
Right. So our often our image of power is gendered, right? It's often masculine, right? So good leaders are identified with masculine characteristics, right? Being strong and decisive and not emotional and rational and logical, right? And I'm not saying that men necessarily are that, but I am saying those things are often, men are often socialized to be that, and we often see those as good characteristics for leaders, right? And so women who are socialized to be and expected to be a little more soft, a little more nurturing, a little more, careful in how they speak. Somehow women have to be both, right? They have to be authoritative enough and strong enough to be seriously considered as a leader, but they also have to respect their gender roles and be somewhat feminine at the same time, right? They have to be two things at once. And that's challenging, right? And that's something that men don't have to be, right? Men just be as they are, and they don't have to worry about trying to be both at the same time. And again, if our conception of leadership wasn't so gendered, it wouldn't be a problem for women either, right? Women could just be women and be leaders at the same time, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. But because our idea of leadership is gendered, a female leader gets seen through the filter of what we think a good leader is, right? And so someone like Hillary Clinton, or really any woman in power, has to somehow, walk that very narrow line between masculine enough to be taken seriously, but also feminine enough to be still seen and accepted as a woman, right? And that's a tricky line for women to walk, right? To try to be two things at once. And maybe I'll add in here the idea that there might be a racial element to this as well, right? Because academics, universities, they are in this part of the world, they're the creation of white people, right? So you could almost say that our idea of power is gendered, but also our ideas of academia are racially determined, right? They're based on whiteness. And so professors who are teaching in an institution like this may also have to balance their racial or ethnic or cultural identity with the expectations of a professor, which are heavily influenced by whiteness, right? And so these women are kind of walking two narrow lines at the same time. They're trying to be feminine because they're women, but also masculine enough to be taken seriously, while also being Black or Latina or Asian, but also trying to be white enough to be taken seriously as scholars. And again, none of that is the way it should be, none of that is right, but these women are kind of trying to walk a lot of lines at the same time in order to fit into our idea of what leadership looks like and what academics look like in a way that white male professors don't have to do or even think about, right? Because they fit into that mold and they're not seen through any filters, right? And so when the old white male professor walks into your classroom and he's a little bit odd and disheveled, you're like, oh yeah, that's the prof, that's what a prof looks like, right? Whereas when a young Black woman walks into your class and she's your professor, suddenly she's seen through a bunch of racial and gender filters, right? Which make it a little more difficult for her to be taken seriously as an authority figure and as a scholar and a teacher. And again, I'm not saying that any of that is right or legitimate, but I'm saying that that's how these things work, and that's why these women are struggling in this way. The other thing that's kind of what makes this tricky is this last point here. The inability to offer definitive proof of the cause, that the cause of their oppression is, inability to offer definitive proof of the cause of their oppression is an added burden. So I think you heard that, or you read that a number of times in the article, was that, these professors were expressing their feelings and their experiences, but they're like, I can't prove it, or I don't know that this was the case, but it felt this way, right? Or I don't know if this is what was going on, but I think it was, right? And so part of the frustration here for them, and even for us kind of trying to understand it, is that sometimes it's not clear what's happening, right? So it's not entirely clear that that the white male students are doing this on purpose. Well, in most cases. In some cases, it's very clearly on purpose. But sometimes it's not clear that the white male students are doing what they're doing on purpose. And maybe sometimes it's not even clear that that's happening. And so these women of color are like, am I imagining things? Like, am I just being oversensitive? Or is this actually happening? I can't prove it to anyone, and I could talk to someone, but I can't show them any evidence that this is actually what's going on. And that's frustrating too, because you constantly are questioning yourself, right? Is this, my students aren't responding well to me. Is it because I'm not a good teacher? Is it because I'm doing something wrong? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm black? Is it because they're white and they're male? Or is something else going on, right? There's almost no way to really definitively prove some of these things because it's just not entirely clear what's happening, right? And again, sometimes you get a very clear example where somebody will say something clearly racist, and you're like, okay, well, we know what that's about. But some of these things, it's just not entirely clear what's going on, and that's what makes it frustrating for everybody to try to understand, because it's not clear that anything's happening or that anyone's doing anything on purpose. And so that's kind of one reason why we have to be very open to the fact that, yeah, we might act out our internalized dominance, or we might be acting out our internalized oppression. We might be behaving in ways that we're not entirely aware of, and we might be having an effect on other people that we don't intend or don't understand, right? So that's why we have to be so careful about saying, dividing up the world into who's racist and who's not, right? Because it's very possible that some of these students are acting in this way, and it could be that they're acting in this way for sexist or based on sexist or racist stereotypes, but they might actually not be entirely aware that they're doing it, right? So we don't want to crucify all of these students for being horrible people, because again, they might not even really realize what they're doing, right? And so it helps to have a little bit of understanding here so that everyone can talk about it and understand, right? But again, if you want to sort of vilify everyone who does, anything even slightly racist or sexist, you sort of close off the conversation, and then nobody can learn anything. And so, I'm not saying what these white students are doing is defensible or correct, because it's not, but also we have to give them a little space to acknowledge that they're probably not all bad people. They probably just are acting in ways that's based on their socialization, and they're acting in ways that they don't understand, right? And so, yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, and that point is a tricky one. It's a tricky point, and it's one that people on social media often don't appreciate or understand, right? So as soon as you say or tweet or Instagram the wrong thing, suddenly, people will hammer you as a racist or a sexist. And again, some people definitely are, and they should be called out for their tweets or behavior, but some people often don't quite realize what they're saying, right? They don't realize how they're acting as a response to their sort of subconscious programming. And so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't call them out, but it does mean that we have to be just a little more understanding in order to have a conversation with people. You can't sort of just hammer people to a pulp and then expect them to say, oh, I see my mistake now, right? They'll get defensive. They'll get very defensive. And so I just thought I would point that out. Okay, so why do some of these white male students act the way they do? Well, again, we've pointed the finger here at socialization, at stereotypes, and at internalized domination, right? So these students have been kind of enculturated and socialized within a culture that is in which whiteness is dominant and which maleness is dominant. And so they've received a lot of messages that the way that they see the world and their experiences and their understandings are actually the correct ones, right? And so that's sometimes why it's so hard for them when they're challenged, because society tells them that they're right? Society tells them that the white way of seeing things is reality, that the male way of seeing things is legitimate and accurate. And so, yeah, again, sometimes it's no surprise that they have a hard time being challenged, because they get a lot of messaging supporting their way of seeing things, right? And so, for example, let's look at some popular television shows here. Anybody watch any of these? Game of Thrones? What's that? Family Guy? Yeah. Simpson, Breaking Bad, excellent show.
Yeah, best show ever.
Anybody? Dexter? Dexter's a few years old now, but he's about a serial killer who kills serial killers. It was big a few years ago. It's got American Idol, Glee, 24, True Blood. Any True Blood fans? Vampires and Werewolves? No? Yeah? No? Who we got? Archer, Criminal Minds. Okay. Parks and Rec is really good. Parks and Recreation is really good. But if you look at a lot of these shows are stories of white people, right? These are the stories of white people. And so Game of Thrones, almost entirely white.
There's no black people. There's indigenous people.
There-
Dothraki.
Okay, so there's Dothraki who are, non-white, but it's not really the story of them, is it? No, they're characters in it. But it's mostly the story of white people, right? As is the Big Bang Theory. Even though we've got Raj as kind of a token person of color there, it's mostly the story of white people. Walking Dead is a little more multicultural. Some of the main characters are white. How I Met Your Mother is all white. What's that one? Supernatural? How's Supernatural in terms of diversity?
It's white, but there's black characters too.
There's some diversity there, yeah. Vampire Diaries is pretty white. Modern Family is mostly white. The Mentalist is white. Family Guy is pink, but Peter Griffin and his family are white, right? Although they do have Cleveland. Yeah, a lot of these shows are the stories of white people. And again, they do have, some of them are a little more diverse. They do have characters of color. They do have people of color in their cast. But again, they're not the stories of people of color. They're the stories of white people, right? So a lot of our media is told from the perspective of white people, and it's told in a way that makes white people kind of the center of the story, right? The center of the universe. People like Cleveland or Raj, they're kind of off on the side, right? The story's not really about them. It's about the main white characters, right? Yeah, so super popular in the past, and it seems to be like enduring popularity. Does anyone watch Friends? Yeah? Again, super white. There's really not a lot of diversity on Friends. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's, from the 1990s. If Friends was rebooted now, it would be more diverse than it was. Yeah, if you look at comics, for instance, Basically, all of these characters are also white, right? So this is the original Justice League from comics and cartoons of the past. Everyone's white unless they're green, right? So they've actually got, I think, is that Martian Manhunter? Is that who that is? Yeah. So there's not even a black person here or an Asian person. Their diversity, they have to actually go to another planet to get someone who is non-white. But everyone from Earth is white, right? This guy, who's this guy? Jesus, right? So the head of not the head of a world religion, but maybe one of the most important figures in one of the largest world religions. Here's Jesus in a way that we are very used to seeing him, because I think as soon as I showed the picture, you knew who this was. But here he is portrayed as a white guy. Do you think he was a white guy?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows, but where was Jesus from? Cleveland? No.
It's like somewhere in the Middle East.
Yeah, he's from the Middle East, right? He's from what's now Israel, but was once Palestine, right? And so he probably didn't look like this. And a number of years ago, some researchers tried to artistically imagine what Jesus may have actually looked like. And again, there's no proof of this. It's a lot of art and just a little bit of science. But they suggested, well, this is actually probably a more realistic version of what Jesus would have looked like, because he would have been a person of color. He would have been a Jewish person living in Palestine 2,000 years ago. And so this is actually, again, we don't know for sure exactly what Jesus would have looked like, but this is actually a much more realistic interpretation of what he may have looked like than this, right? This is a white dude, right? And the thing is that, Jesus was likely not a white dude. He was a Jewish person living in the Middle East, living in Palestine. And again, this is a much more representative picture of what he would have looked like. But again, people envision the Son of God, right? That's a high position, right? The Son of God is a white guy. What does that mean about God?
White.
He's a white guy too, right? And again, whether you subscribe to that faith or not, that's probably an important thing to remember, is that to millions of people around the world, they think of God and Jesus as white guys, not as people of color. And Daniel's saying, what if Jesus was in fact black? And I think that's probably unlikely, but what if he was? Or why don't we ever portray him as a black man? I think it's equally unlikely that he was a black man as it was that he was a white man. I think that this is probably a much more representative face of what the Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like. But so I think there's probably like a 0.1% chance that he looked like this, and probably a 0.1% chance that he was a black man. But still, we're very comfortable portraying him like this, even though the odds are highly unlikely that he looked like this. More so that he looked like this, that he looked like a Jewish or a Palestinian man. Yeah. And Daniel says, if he was black, that would change a lot of things. Yeah, I think it probably would, right? Part of the social messaging that circulates around dominant groups is the idea that they have a right to their position, right? And so, yeah, like if you see white people in power, of course that makes sense, because when you go to church, you see that God is white too. Right? So it makes perfect sense that white people are in charge of society when you also see, your gods looking the same way, right? And again, I don't want to get into sort of religious theology here, and I don't want to disrupt anyone's belief system, but it is interesting that Jesus and sometimes God's not God's not portrayed as a human quite so often as Jesus is. But yeah, I think it's noteworthy that they are portrayed as white when I think the reality would have been that we probably wouldn't see them as white guys. They probably would have looked, or Jesus would have looked a lot closer to this than the way that he's often shown. Yeah, and that goes all the way back to religious, or other religious art shows that same pattern. And so here, who do we have? Yeah, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? And so here's the classic scene where Eve takes a fruit from the tree of knowledge. She's been tempted by that snake, and the snake says, "You look hungry, eat an apple," right? And so Eve takes a bite of the apple and she shares it with Adam. Of course, that's the one thing that Yahweh had told them not to do. So they are kicked out of paradise and they have to, work for a living after this, right? So all of the bad things in the world come from the eating of the apple and the disobeying of God's, his one rule, right? But it's like Pandora's box this morning, right? People tell you not to open the box. What are you going to do? You're going to open the box, right? So God says, don't eat the apple. What are they going to do? Of course they're going to eat it. Come on, God. This is basic psychology. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But here, again, we see the first people, right? The first people ever created by God, white people, right? Even to the point where, when we were talking about the phrenology and the craniometry, right? Those 5 races that were identified by some scientists in the 1700s. One of them, actually, Blumenbach, thought that, yeah, the original people were white because he'd seen art like this, and he imagined that people who were not white had somehow degenerated, right? They didn't eat well enough, or they spent too much time in the sun, and so, if they took better care of themselves, they could be white again, just like the first people, right? So, what? It's true in that that's what he believed. That's the extent of the truth. It's wrong, but that's what he thought. Yeah, so here you get some messages about whiteness that are true of any dominant group. So it doesn't really matter what kind of oppression you're dealing with. There are examples where, that says it's better to be white, right? The default human experience is white. God is white. The first people were white. And so again, if you absorb all these social messages, it becomes very easy to see white people in power. It becomes very easy to, see the white experience as the default one, because there's so much media out there that portrays people's lives from a white perspective, right? And people of color and people of other sexualities or abilities are kind of pushed to the side and are kind of supporting characters in the lives of white people. Again, that's changing now, but in the past it was like that. And so, yeah, these messages are everywhere, and they kind of reinforce the idea that white is right. So hopefully that doesn't get taken out of context on the internet, because then I'll be in a lot of trouble. But that's what all these messages are trying to communicate, right? That this experience of one particular racial group is the right way of seeing things and the way that reality actually is. When in fact, we've talked about positionality, the idea that there are kind of lots of different ways to see society, and the way you see it depends a lot on your social group and how that social group relates to the social messages that are circulating around. And so again, with Indigenous people, we saw that even though they're living in our country and in our city, we're living in a city together. See, almost did it. Even though we're living in the same city, in the same country, Indigenous people are having a different experience of Canada and Vancouver than some of the rest of us are, right? And so that kind of proves that, there's not one reality, there's just different ways of seeing that reality. But of course, the messaging around dominant groups say that the way the dominant group sees it and the way the dominant group experiences it that's the way it is. That's how it really is, right? Okay, you want to take a break? Yeah, me too. Okay, take a quick break, come back, and then we'll talk about white supremacy. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about the delay there. So what we were talking about before the break is, again, the idea that these white male students are behaving in a certain way. It's not great. Some of the ways that they behaved, or that we heard about these students behaving in the article, there's no excuse for, right? There's no excuse for acting intimidating and threatening towards people. Some of those racial comments that were made in class about black people are only 10% and we'll squash you, that has no place in the classroom either. But some of the ways that these young men were behaving was probably not entirely in their awareness, right? And again, I'm saying that part of it has to do with social messaging and the kind of constant messages in Canadian and American society that the white perspective is the correct one, right? And the way that things are and should be, and the things that are connected to white people are the most important things. And again, these are subtle messages, right? These are subtle messages, and they're ones that we learn without really realizing we're learning them, right? So nobody watches, who watches Friends or has watched Friends? Yeah. So none of us watch Friends and get the message that, oh, white people are the most important, right? That's not the message of Friends, right? It's about friendship and fun and these young people living in New York and living their lives and comedy. That's what it's about. But at the same time, it can subtly transmit the message that, this is the experience that is, legitimate or cool or correct or most important, right? And again, Friends doesn't mean to do that, but when Friends is just one of many shows that are all focused around the lives of white people, again, it transmits that idea, right, without meaning to. And people absorb those messages also without meaning to, right? And again, that's why these things are difficult to identify and talk about, because there's a lot of things happening that nobody really means to happen, but they happen anyway. Let's go back to the movies. We talked about movies during the sexism unit, right? About how they transmit social messages about what men and women should be, right? What it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, what it is to kind of fall in love or be a hero, or what's a good family. All of these things, all these ideas exist within movies. But again, whose stories are these? And so if you look at, my statistics might be a year or two old here, but the highest grossing films worldwide, so the films that made the most money globally, all of them are directed by men, right? There's only one, as of a couple years ago, there was only one woman director for these films, and that was the director of Frozen is a woman. And then there was one man of color for Furious 7. All of those other 23 highest grossing movies, all directed by men, right? The top 100 films worldwide, 99 are directed by men, and 95 of them directed by white people. So again, one group of people, basically white men, are telling stories to the entire world, right? And what kind of ideas are being communicated in those movies, because they're being told from the perspective of white people and white men and white male culture, right? It's spreading those ideas not only in North America, but also around the world, right? And again, I'm not saying necessarily that there's anything wrong with any of these movies, but I'm just saying consider what's going on here. Sometimes what we see in the movies when we have a story that centers around race is stories that are created around a white savior narrative. Has anyone ever heard of this before? There's lots and lots of movies that kind of follow this. You've heard of it? Yeah? There's lots and lots of movies that follow this basic approach. And kind of what happens, here's a few of them. Although the one on the far right there is a bit of a joke. Yeah, but in all of these stories, you have something to do with race. And often what you have is one white person, usually a white man, but sometimes a white woman, basically rescuing people of color. And so what you'll see here in movies with white savior narratives is that you have a white person, you know, rescues people of someone of a person or people of color in some way, and in the process they learn something about themselves, right? So again, the movie's not really about race or racism. It's really about the white person, right? And they learn something about themselves by rescuing a person or people of color, right? Again, they're told from the perspective of white people, and again, it makes the white person the hero, right? The people of color are usually the people to be saved, right? And so in a way, you can compare this to the old idea of the male hero, right? So the man swoops in to save the damsel in distress, and the woman's like, oh, save me, brave whoever, right? And so the woman kind of does nothing. She's just there to be rescued by the male character. And this is kind of the racial equivalent of that, where people of color are powerless to help themselves, and they need a white person, usually a white man, to swing in and somehow rescue them or do things that they seem not to be able to do for themselves, right? And so sometimes this involves like an adoption of a baby of color. You're kind of smiling. Does this ring a bell? I'll give you a minute to chew and then you can tell me. Sometimes the white person goes to an exotic country, right? They go overseas or they go to Africa and they rescue the people of Africa from something or other. There's lots of movies like this. Which one are you thinking of one specifically?
The Blind Side.
Blind Side is like that.
There was that black kid who was homeless, and the white woman very kindly took him in.
Yeah, The Blind Side. A young black child is rescued and adopted by a white woman, right? So, what's that? Yeah, that's a football movie. Yeah, perfect example. And again, there's lots and lots of examples of this type of film. And again, they seem good, right? They seem like, oh, this is great, but none of them really addresses racism in a meaningful way. They just use racism and people of color as a prop for white people to feel good, right? And so white people can watch a movie like this and feel good about, oh, that's great. Racism is over, right? And again, it's not really the case. The people of color are usually being used as a plot device for these white people to be heroic, right? To feel kind of better about themselves. And I'll admit, one of the movies that I enjoyed as a kid is exactly like this. Has anyone seen this movie? It's sad because it's a perfect example of a white savior narrative. Indiana Jones, who we've met in the Harrison Ford video essay, Indiana Jones, adventuring archaeologist, gets in a plane crash in India. And so his plane crashes in India. He finds his way to this small village, and he finds out that this evil cult has kidnapped all of the children from the village and stole their sacred stone. And so he goes off to the castle. He fights the evil cult, retrieves the magic stone, the stone, rescues all of the children, and is the hero, right? And again, seemingly none of these Indian villagers can help themselves in any way. They need a white man to literally fall from the sky like an angel or something in order to rescue them. And so I feel a little bit bad because I did enjoy this movie as a young person, and I still do kind of enjoy it, but it's a heavy-duty white savior narrative. He swoops in and saves the day for these poor Indian villagers, saves all of their children. You know, it ends very triumphantly, and Indiana Jones is a hero of the village, but it's a pretty pretty heavy-duty white savior narrative that's going on in here, unfortunately. Yeah, there always is. There's always talk of it, but you never know. Right, and so what we'll talk about next is kind of this idea of white superiority and white supremacism, but I think what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about your final paper first, okay? So what I'm going to do is, good, I'm going to switch to, nope, that's not what I want to see. I want to see, oh, that's because Teams is not open. Now Teams is open and it's on the screen, good. Let me see. Social justice 12. Assignments. Okay, so here's what I would like you to do for your final paper. And so in some ways it's not going to be much different from, I've got to add some things to this document too, which I will. In some ways it's not going to be very different from what we've been doing with the micropapers, because really the micropapers have been kind of a dry run for this one, right? That was the point of them. So in some ways I want you to do the same thing. And as you can see here, I want your paper to focus on just one of these three things. And so as you can see, they're a little bit open-ended, and so you can kind of go in different places if you want to talk about racism or sexism or heterosexism or religious oppression or whatever. You can probably do that with each of these. The first one is, in what ways are different social justice issues actually interconnected? And so what I'm kind of asking you here is to explain to me how oppressions can be thought of as the same. How do we see it operating in the same way, even though, you know, oppression or racism toward black people in the United States might be entirely different from, you know, heterosexism or discrimination against gay or lesbian people, right? So those things seem like two different things, but explain to me the kind of basic way in which they're the same, okay? The second one, how do individual worldviews, so yours or someone else's, shape or inform our understanding of social justice issues? This one might be a little bit tricky. It is actually there's a few things I need to add into this. I'm going to add to this. This is kind of has to do with a little bit of positionality work, but also in terms of how you understand racism or how you understand sexism or something else. So you're kind of taking a step back and looking at how people understand the social justice things that we've been talking about, right? And so how does who they are or who you are, how does that influence how you understand the things that we've talked about in this class? That one might be a little bit tricky, but for some of you, maybe a light will go on and you'll want to work on that one. The third one is probably, I think, the most straight ahead question. But it's, what are the causes of a particular instance or manifestation of social inequality? How does it affect people? And how might it be remedied? And so I think that's kind of most similar to the topic we did on the first micropaper. I asked you something, but I gave you a manifestation of social inequality, and I asked you that question about people with disabilities, right? So here I'm asking you that question, but I'm kind of leaving it a little more open to you. For this one, I'll caution you, and I'll say that if you do this, what I want you to do is kind of drill down and look at something that is more specific than just a single cause of oppression, okay? So if you chose number 3, I wouldn't want you to do it on racism, because racism is huge, right? All of the ways that people are disadvantaged, all of the different kind of races and ethnicities that might fit into a minoritized group, it's all way too much. I want you to narrow it down. And so for a question like number 3, think about what Adam Pearson did with his documentary. Adam Pearson was talking about people with disabilities, but in a lot of ways he had focused it all the way into just people with facial disfigurements, right? And again, he did talk to the young man in the wheelchair, whose name I now forget. But that's really what Adam was focused on, right? Just that one group of people, people with facial disfigurements, and how they're affected by society, and what are some remedies, right? And so his documentary was almost kind of what this paper is asking. But again, if you want to do something with number 3, make sure you narrow your focus down, because if you just say sexism or racism, it's just too big and too general, and you can't really say anything kind of specific and useful about it because the topic's too big. And as a word of advice to you, sometimes it's hard to do this with papers, but when you write a paper in like university, really the more narrow the topic is, the better it is to write about it, right? Sometimes I think students are worried if they make their focus too small that they won't be able to write anything, and so they think if they go with racism they'll have lots. But something like racism is way too big, and you're not able to say anything interesting or meaningful because it'll just be too general. And so Adam Pearson's documentary was interesting because he just focused it on people with facial disfigurements, right? That was it. And again, there's all kinds of people out there with different types of disabilities and different types of challenges. And he kind of put those aside and said, I'm just going to focus on this one thing. And he had a lot to say about it and a lot to show us, right? And so really, if you can come up with a narrower topic, the more focused your topic is, actually the easier it is to find material and to write it. And the easier it is to not say, super general things, because super general things are not that interesting. It's more interesting to have something that's specific and narrow, right? And so that'll be my advice to you here, but it'll also be my advice to you in other papers. Try to drill down and create a very focused topic. And then you can actually say interesting things and you can dig into it. But again, when it's too general, it's hard to say anything interesting because it's just too big. And all you wind up saying is things that kind of people already know. And what's that? It kind of becomes very cliche because it's just too general, right? Pollution is bad. It's like, yeah, we know, right? But if you narrow it down to maybe a particular type of pollution in a particular type of environment, in a particular place, then you can really start to pull some interesting things out of it. But if you just say pollution is bad, it's like, yeah, we all know, right? So the kind of more focused you can be, actually the easier your paper will be to write. And it'll be easier to find things too, because you'll know exactly what you're looking for, right? If you're looking for illegal dumping of industrial waste in, rural Canada, then you really know what you're looking for, and you don't have to worry about plastics in the ocean or, carbon in the atmosphere or whatever, right? You know exactly what you're looking for, and you can ignore a lot of the stuff that's out there. And again, that's part of the problem of researching, is sometimes you find too much and you don't know what to take, right? So the narrower your focus can be, the easier it will be to more interesting things you can actually say if you focus. If you go too general, it gets kind of, like you mentioned, it gets kind of cliche, and you don't wind up saying anything interesting. You just wind up saying the things that we all know. Yes, racism is bad. Yes, people are disadvantaged. Yes, we should fix it, but more focused is better.
What is the structure of the essay? Like 3 main body paragraph, 1 in intro, and 1 conclusion?
Yeah, similar structure to what you've been doing. So an intro and a conclusion and body paragraphs. I don't have it on here, but I'll put it on here shortly. I'm looking for about 1,500 words from you, so about twice the size of the original micropaper. Remember that body paragraphs, you should start a new paragraph every time you start a new idea, right? So sometimes we use, in English they teach us always to have 3 body paragraphs, but don't try and cram things into 3 if they don't fit, right? If you only have 2 ideas, although you should probably have a little more in a paper like this, but If you only have two ideas, in a short paper, you should only have two body paragraphs. If you have four main premises that support your conclusion, you should have four, right? And maybe they'll be a little shorter or longer, but every time you kind of switch to a new idea, that's when you switch to a new paragraph, right? So don't be afraid to use a new paragraph. They don't cost anything. They're free. You just hit enter a couple times and you're good. Don't be afraid to start a new paragraph. Usually what I find in students writing is I wind up encouraging them to make a new paragraph rather than to squish two of them together. So in my experience, students don't add a new paragraph when they should more often than they have too many of them, okay? So again, if you have 3 premises for your argument, then yeah, you probably have 3 body paragraphs. If you have 4, then you probably have 4 paragraphs, right? So paragraphs should be structured in terms of each new idea, and everything in that paragraph should support that idea. And again, not every paragraph has to be the same length either, right? Some premises might be very easily explained with, less. Some premises might need a little more. So paragraphs don't have to all be the same length. You don't have to have a certain number of them, but they should each be focused on kind of one premise, and everything in there should be supporting that premise. Okay? So about 1,500 words. I'd like you to use about 5 sources, if you could. I didn't put that in here, but I will. Again, MLA formatting, which some of you are getting really good at, so that's nice to see. Due date, I was going to make it for the Friday, December the 4th, the last day of class. But as I mentioned in my history class, I was honest with myself. I'm not going to mark them over the weekend. So, so you may as well take those extra 2 days to work on them rather than hand them in on Friday and then I don't do anything with them till Monday. That's not fair to you. So you may as well take those extra 2 days, okay? So I'll add the 1,500 words into this and the 5 sources into this as well.
Is that necessary that we use 5 sources, or can we just choose 1 or 2 that's more related?
I would like you to use a few more if you can. Keep in mind that you don't have to use everything from a single source, right? One source might have just kind of 1 or 2 things that you might find useful. So again, just because you have a source and you take something from it doesn't mean you have to take everything from it, right? Maybe they just make one point that you're like, oh yeah, I really want to include that, right? In some cases, and you'll see this in Shavella Pittman's article, in some cases, the citation is just the fact that it exists, right? So you don't have to do this, but Shavella Pittman might say, some people have done a lot of work on gendered racism in the classroom, and then she'll cite a bunch of sources, right? And basically the citation is that these works exist and they talk about this thing, and that's all she's doing with them. You don't have to do that, but again, you don't have to take everything from a single source. You can just say, you know what, this author says something that I really like. I'm going to borrow it and I'll cite it. The rest of their article I don't care about because I'm talking about this. So again, 5 sources sounds like a lot, but again, you don't have to use everything from every single source. And academics don't either, right? Sometimes they just pull the conclusion of the article and they cite that. Sometimes they just cite it and say, people have worked on this topic, like all of these sources. And so, yeah, don't be panicked by the 5 sources. Some of them will be more important to you than others, but I just want you to do a few more this time. You can see here that there's a marking guide that I've set up. It's also in Microsoft Teams here. Ooh, that's big. And so this looks exactly the same as it did before, but I've added a knowledge section. And again, this is what I was talking about at the beginning of class. I want to see that you get it, right? So I want to see you kind of use terminology from class. I want to see you talk about things in the way that we've talked about them here. And so I'll be reading your papers. I'll be looking at your argument and the way that you lay out the answer to one of these questions, but I'll also kind of be looking for, does this person understand what we've been talking about? Are they talking about their issue in a way that shows that they have learned something from this class. Okay, so that's a little bit intuitive on my part, but that's what I'll be looking for as well, is some sort of evidence that, you know, that you've been here and that you get it, right? I just saw this earlier. I'm going to put it up. Gabrielle says, I look like a younger version of Walter White. If you're referring to me, Gabrielle, I'm not sure. Is that a compliment?
Yeah, like you're not a chemistry teacher.
I'm not a chemistry teacher. I do not know how to cook meth, I promise.
On an RV.
In an RV. I don't have an RV. I've never killed anyone. I don't know. Oh, maybe she's talking about Jesus. Gabrielle, were you talking about Jesus? Does he look like a younger version of Walter White? I don't know. Gabrielle also asked here, do we have to find articles for like past papers? Yes, absolutely. Please find 5 of them. Again, you don't have to use every single thing from every single paper. That's not really the way academics work either. Some sources may wind up being more important for you than others, or you might pull more from one source and maybe there's just one thing from another source that you like. Yeah, that's kind of how these things work. So, so that's all the time we have. I'm going to update these things in Student Portal because they are, I'd like to add a few things to them, like the word count and the sources and things. Any questions before we pack it up and go? Like one of the articles that we've read in class?
Sure.
Yes. Yes, you can. Yeah, you can. If there's an article that we've used in class that works for you, you can use it. Of course, you have to cite it just like you normally would, but you can use it. Yes. Okay.
You do look like Walter White on the screen.
Do I?
Yeah, you look like him.
Should I do the "I'm the one who knocks"
Yeah.
line?
I'm
No.
gonna
No. No, I'm not going to do that. Okay, that is all for today, people. You may go. Have a nice afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow.